Welcome to Popcorn Playback. Today we have another movie recap for you. But before we get to the storyline, like and subscribe for more recaps, and have a great day.
In the heart of a rural Georgia plantation, owned by the formidable Mr. Paul Bennett in the United States, Alice had endured years of unyielding enslavement, her spirit yearning for freedom. One fateful night, Alice clandestinely married her beloved Joseph, but their joy was shattered by the sound of Mr. Paul's gunshot. The following day, while toiling under the scorching sun, Joseph's attention was drawn to a rabbit. However, Mr. Paul interpreted it differently and subjected Joseph to a brutal punishment. Meanwhile, Alice served Mr. Paul a glass of water, her heart heavy with the sight of her husband's suffering. As night fell, Alice and Ruthie, Joseph's mother, decided to visit him in secret to check on his well-being. In the dimly lit room where other workers tended to Joseph's wounds, they discussed their deep-seated desire to escape the plantation. They knew that any misstep in their plan would lead to certain death, and with a heavy heart, they decided to reconsider their escape plot. Alice couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be another way. It was then that Joseph confided in her, revealing that Mr. Paul was aware of their secret marriage. The next day, Mr. Paul married Joseph off to one of his neighbor's domestic workers. But Joseph adamantly refused, in a chilling agreement between Mr. Paul and Brother Levi. The first child Joseph fathered would belong to Brother Levi. Every Sunday, Mr. Paul's cruel desires forced Alice into a heart-wrenching ordeal. The darkness of their situation weighed heavily on Joseph, and he sought solace in a way to break free. Speaking to a fellow worker, Joseph heard a haunting tale of a previous escape attempt that had ended in tragedy. Visiting the burial site, he discovered a lone lighter, a harbinger of change. As Mr. Paul's son returned home for the holidays, Mrs. Bennett's enigmatic remark caught Alice's attention. That night, Joseph stealthily entered Alice's room, revealing the lighter, a symbol of hope amidst despair. As the couple realized the horrors hidden within the plantation, they made a solemn vow to escape. Joseph instructed Alice to watch for a signal, but their escape plan took an unexpected turn. Joseph was shot as he tried to secure Aaron's gun. In those dire moments, with their future hanging in the balance, Alice pleaded with Joseph to run, but he didn't get far before Aaron's gunshot silenced him forever. Alice, devastated by the loss of her beloved husband, struggled to maintain her composure. That very night, during a dinner with his son, Mr. Paul exhibited his perverse tendencies, objectifying Alice's beauty. Enraged, she lashed out at him, but he swiftly overpowered her. Mr. Paul called upon Aaron for assistance in restraining Alice, tying her up with a rope and gagging her before leaving her alone outside, exposed to the elements throughout the night. The following morning, Mr. Paul untied Alice and, to her surprise, expressed a desire to move past the previous night's horrific events. He handed her a glass jug of water, but Alice couldn't bear the weight of her anguish any longer. With determination in her eyes, she struck Mr. Paul on the head with the glass jug and attempted to escape. He swiftly caught her and began to strangle her, but Alice, fighting for her life, grabbed a shard of the broken glass and thrust it into Mr. Paul's eyes. In agony, he released her, and Alice seized her chance to flee into the neighboring woods. With each step, fear and confusion guided her through the dense forest until she stumbled upon a highway, disoriented and lost. Just as panic set in, a speeding truck approached. To her amazement, the truck miraculously screeched to a halt just inches from where she stood. The shock of the moment overwhelmed her, and she collapsed in front of the truck. The truck's driver, a man named Frank, rushed to her aid, carrying her into the vehicle. When Alice regained consciousness, fear consumed her, and she began to scream. Frank did his best to calm her down, attempting to strike up a conversation, asking if she knew where she was or what year it was. Alice's confusion deepened as she vomited inside the truck. Recognizing that Alice needed medical attention, Frank made the decision to take her to the hospital. Within the hospital's walls, Alice wandered off briefly, but Frank located her and brought her to the front desk. The receptionist requested her name and details, but Alice could only manage to provide her first name, her past still shrouded in the darkness of the plantation. Upon arriving at the hospital, Alice encountered Frank's brother Danny. After a brief conversation, he extended an invitation to his home, where he offered her some bologna and blackcurrant juice. He provided her with clean clothes and a comfortable bed for the night. Still bewildered by her newfound environment, Alice couldn't shake her sense of disorientation. The following morning, Frank prepared breakfast for Alice and handed her some books in the hope of jogging her memory. He then headed off to work, leaving her to explore and regain her sense of self. Alice busied herself, browsing through books and a directory, hoping to find a way to reach out to someone named Mrs. Rachel Bennett. As she delved into the pages of books about the history of slavery, her understanding of her own past began to take shape. She realized that she had been a slave for years, and the weight of that revelation settled upon her. Her newfound knowledge marked her transition from a life of enslavement to one of freedom. When Frank returned home, he found that Alice had prepared dinner for him. During the meal, he suggested that she needed to regain her lost memories. However, Alice, with unwavering conviction, declared that her memory was intact, and she knew everything about her past and where she came from, that she had been a slave. Frank, unable to comprehend the gravity of her words, questioned if she truly understood what she was saying, as he couldn't assist her in seeking justice. In response, Alice informed Frank that she had plans to meet someone the following day, hinting at a possible path towards addressing her newfound reality and seeking justice for her past. The next morning, Franklin drove Alice to the diner where she was meant to meet Mrs. Rachel Bennett. Frank offered to accompany her inside, but Alice declined. She ordered a cup of coffee and anxiously awaited Mrs. Rachel Bennett's arrival. Finally, Mrs. Rachel Bennett entered the diner, accompanied by her son Daniel. She initiated a conversation with Alice, attempting to explain that she had been working to create a safe and disciplined home. Alice, however, vehemently objected, accusing her of deception. She lashed out, expressing her deep-seated resentment and pain, accusing Mrs. Bennett of abandoning them and showing no care for their suffering. In the midst of the heated argument, Mrs. Rachel Bennett tried to assert her authority over Alice, but Alice, no longer willing to be silenced or intimidated, issued a blunt threat. She declared that she was no longer afraid of Mrs. Bennett and the oppressive system she represented. The confrontation escalated, with Mrs. Bennett claiming that Alice couldn't possibly understand the concept of freedom, even if it took her 1,000,000 years. At that moment, Alice's patience ran out, and she delivered a resounding slap to Mrs. Rachel Bennett's face. Stunned, Mrs. Bennett quickly made her exit, leaving the diner with her son in tow. Frank, witnessing the intense and dramatic scene, immediately called out to Alice. However, she was too overcome with emotion to respond. Instead, she sprinted out of the diner, chasing after Mrs. Bennett as she drove away. Outside, Franklin tried to calm Alice down, but her determination burned fiercely. She expressed her desire to return to Mr. Paul's plantation to rescue others who were still ensnared in the same brutal system she had escaped from. After the dramatic encounter with Mrs. Rachel Bennett, Alice continued her research, determined to gather information and resources for her upcoming rescue mission. Despite Frank's earnest attempts to dissuade her, Alice remained resolute in her mission and asked for his assistance. She tried to convince him that they could make a difference, but Frank revealed a painful truth. He had lost his mother fighting for the same cause, and he knew the danger that lay ahead. Frank cautioned Alice that a black man's fight for freedom in a white man's land was a potential death sentence. He advised her to go ahead with her mission, as she had nothing to lose, lacking a birth certificate, ID, or social security. Although Alice felt disheartened, she refused to abandon her mission. At work, Frank's somber mood was evident, and when his brother inquired about his well-being, Frank pushed him away, seeking solitude to deal with his thoughts. Meanwhile, at the bus station, Alice awaited transportation. To her surprise, Frank pulled up in his truck, asking her to join him so they could carry out the mission together. Arriving at the location, Alice began to spread fuel around the land where Mr. Paul's plantation was located. In the background, Frank made a call to the fire station. As the plan took shape, Alice expressed her pride in Frank and believed that his mother would also be proud of him for standing up for justice. Together, they climbed into the truck and drove toward Mr. Paul's compound, determined to confront the injustice that had persisted for far too long. As the approaching truck drew nearer, Mr. Paul sensed the impending threat and urgently ordered everyone to get behind the building. However, much to his surprise, no one obeyed his command. They all stood there, curiosity piqued, eager to see who was driving into the compound. Moments later, Alice and Frank emerged from the truck. Alice brandished a gun, aiming it directly at Mr. Paul. Aaron attempted to approach, but Frank intervened, preventing him from getting closer. Alice made it clear that her intention was for everyone to witness the truth, to expose the man who had deceived them for so long. Mr. Paul, attempting to downplay the situation, suggested that Alice had only created more work for them. But Alice vehemently objected, declaring that they were no longer working for him. She accused Mr. Paul of lying to them, manipulating them to feel important. She asserted her intelligence and superiority over him. In response, Mr. Paul defended himself, claiming that he had given them a meaningful life by not telling anyone they could stay or go. However, the memory of the man who had owned the lighter resurfaced. Alice revealed the grim truth that Mr. Paul had killed and buried the man on this very land. Defiant, Mr. Paul questioned Alice about her intentions, asking if she planned to kill him. Alice's response was chilling and unwavering. She told him that she wasn't going to end his life, but instead intended to make his last breath a living hell, ensuring that he paid for the atrocities he had committed. In response to Alice's chilling determination, Mr. Paul directed his rage towards her and attempted to attack. However, Alice acted swiftly, shooting him in the leg. With his wound slowing him down, she managed to tie him up and drag him outside, where the sound of approaching sirens could be heard. As the police and firefighters arrived at the scene, the onlookers watched in amazement as Alice secured Mr. Paul to a rod. Frank took the initiative to meet the firefighter team, while Joseph, who had managed to make his way outside with a bit of assistance, staggered toward Alice. Overwhelmed with emotion, Alice approached him, tears in her eyes, and they shared a heartfelt hug. One of the firefighters approached Alice and asked for her name, recognizing that revenge had been long overdue. The scene set the stage for the culmination of this dramatic story, marking the end of the movie.
That's all for this movie. Thank you for watching.